how an impossible plan allowed American tanks to advance faster than Germany could react. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was muffled by the distant thunder of artillery. The sky, gray and heavy, seemed to reflect the gravity of the moment. The beach, now preparing for the largest invasion in history, felt like a battleground. Thousands of men were about to land on the shores of Normandy, unaware that the future of the war would change in this moment. The battle on the ground would be decisive, but it would not just be fought by the men who landed, it would be fought by the machines that followed. On the front lines, a German commander watched the American tanks approaching. With a cynical smile, he murmured, "These machines have no chance against our blitzkrieg." The sound of his words echoed across the beach, but he had no idea that he was witnessing the beginning of his own defeat. What he didn't know was that on this day, he was witnessing the start of his own defeat. The birth of the monster. The story of the M4 Sherman begins in the early years of World War II. Faced with initial confrontations against Hitler's forces, the Americans needed a machine capable of taking on the mighty Panzer tanks. The mission seemed impossible. The Sherman project started with significant challenges. The goal was simple: create something efficient, fast, and at the same time easier to produce than the heavy German tanks. But instead, the engineers faced a series of failures. The early prototypes were too heavy, with engines that failed during tests and armor that couldn't withstand German cannons. Soon, the Sherman was described as a war machine destined to fail. Its construction was not up to the threat the Americans were facing. In the early tests, the failures were glaring. The tank, with all its flaws and limitations, was quickly deemed a failure in progress. A tin can on wheels, critics said. No one imagined that this apparent failure carried the seed of victory. Baptism by fire. Initial defeat. The moment arrived, 1943. The M4 Sherman, now modified and refined, was finally deployed to the front lines. However, the real test was far from a celebration. When the American tanks encountered the mighty Panzer IV and Tiger tanks, the performance of the Sherman was devastatingly inferior. Field reports described the disaster with brutal honesty. One report said, "Flies like a brick." The Sherman was easily defeated, crushed by the 75mm guns of the Panzers. The battle seemed lost. Many began to doubt the effectiveness of the M4, and the idea that this machine could compete with German supremacy seemed increasingly impossible. The first days of combat brought a humiliating defeat. The sound of American tanks being destroyed and the earth being swept by Nazi attacks was palpable. The war, already at a critical point, seemed to be losing yet another battle. The M4 Sherman, until that moment, seemed doomed to failure. It was just another war machine that failed in its mission. The invisible turning point. But the story of a warrior is not written in its defeats, and the Sherman would be no different. Amid all the destruction, something changed. The battlefield revealed a secret. It wasn't brute force that would change the course of the war, it was the speed and maneuverability of the Sherman. The agility with which these tanks could move, flank, and cut through enemy lines turned out to be an unexpected advantage. Over time, the engineers improved the design, armor was reinforced, and battle tactics were adapted. More importantly, the Sherman began to be used differently, in surprise tactics, quick and coordinated strikes, no longer for direct confrontations with the feared German tanks. It became the weapon of a fast and relentless war. In the days that followed, those who had initially doubted the Sherman's capabilities began to see its potential. The M4, with all its limitations, found its reason for being in modern warfare. The battlefield changed. That failure became the beginning of a new era of warfare. The escalation of terror. The war was changing. The Sherman tanks began to dominate the battlefield. Enemy resistance grew increasingly desperate. The Germans, who once laughed at the Sherman, now began to feel fear. Reports from Wehrmacht officers started to reflect a tone of respect. "They don't stop. We can't keep up. They're everywhere." The incessant cadence of the Sherman's guns sounded like thunder, and the war became a psychological battle. Where the Germans had once been confident, now they were being pushed back. The sound of American war machines reverberated through the battlefield, and the numbers of victories began to rise. The M4 Sherman was becoming an unstoppable machine, not through its strength, but through its strategy and resilience. The resistance was futile. The American tanks didn't stop. They advanced without end. The doctrine of power. But the revolution of the Sherman wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. What the tank represented was a shift in the logic of war. While the Germans relied on brute force and firepower, the Americans invested in mass production and agility. The M4 Sherman was designed to be efficient in number and speed, more than in individual invincibility. War is not just about brute force, it's about endurance, adaptation, and ingenuity. The Sherman became a symbol of American supremacy not only in combat, but in planning and war strategy. It represented modern warfare, a war in which speed, strategy, and mass production mattered more than raw power. The Sherman was not the best tank, but it was there where the war happened, in large numbers and with every move. The final judgment, poetic closure. The advance of the Sherman tanks continued, destroying enemy lines, liberating cities, and taking the war into the very heart of the Reich. Where once the enemy laughed and underestimated, now the truth was undeniable. The sound of laughter had given way to the roar of American engines, and terror was palpable. The Germans saw their defenses being destroyed by a machine they once scorned. They laughed when they saw it for the first time. They stopped laughing when they realized the sound of laughter had merged with the thunder of defeat. The M4 Sherman was not just a war machine. It was a symbol of resilience, overcoming adversity, and ingenuity. Its success wasn't just technical, but a lesson on how the unexpected and the limitations could become the greatest strengths in a world at war.